And we're back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm your host, Dan Besbris. You can find me on Twitter at Dan Besbris. You can find the Old Man Squad on Twitter at Old Man Squad. Keeping that one simple. Shout out to all the amazing podcast hosts that we've been able to snowball up here into the Old Man Squad already. Some fun shows that dropped today. Kings Weekly had Law Murray on as a guest talking Jerry West. That show just dropped. Our buddy Stephen Bagel, the Bagel Man, had himself a show as well. What was that one on? That was talking Sixers. Actually, that's good timing, given what some of the stuff we're going to get into on today's episode of this podcast, which feels like a good segue into that right now. It's Rumor Mill Day in the NBA. I don't know why it's all today. Oh, yes, I do. It's because the finals are over. Congratulations, he says begrudgingly, to the Boston Celtics, who took care of business, wrapped up the NBA Finals in 5 games. Another gentleman's sweep. A gentleman's sweep. Went ahead and gave Dallas Game 4. Stomped them in Game 5. Having a bunch, actually, in the playoffs this year. Teams that were just like, we're up 3-0. We're good. Nuggets did it to the Lakers. Mavs did it to the Wolves. Boston here. Was there another one? There might have been another one in there. But that's the reason that everything is dropping today. And when I say everything is dropping, I mean, we got all sorts of fun stuff. Eric Pincus, who is a brilliant NBA journalist, put out the educated guesses list for Bleacher Report on where he thinks NBA free agents are going to sign this year. We're going to go through some of the biggest names on that list. He put out 11 of them and what it would mean from a fantasy standpoint. Get ourselves ready. Also, the battle is on in Los Angeles. Anthony Irwin, noted Lakers coverage expert, tweeted this morning that it's done, that JJ Redick is the coach of the Los Angeles Lakers. Shams went on the Pat McAfee show to say, not so fast. But what Shams didn't say was incorrect. He just said, not quite. Which kind of makes you think it's probably done, and there just hasn't been the true Lakers or JJ stamp of approval on it yet. So what does it all mean, man? What does it all mean, man? That's what we're talking about on today's episode. Let's start with the Lakers side, because that one is the less impactful fantasy news than if a bunch of large name free agents change teams. Let's say JJ Redick is the next head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers. Does it change anything at all in LA? I think the answer to that is sort of like a soft yes. And I mentioned this on a show about 2 weeks ago when it looked like it was going to be Redick, and then they pivoted to Hurley, and now they've pivoted back to Redick. My thought was, going in this kind of untested, recent former player direction and not pulling a name out of the assistant coaching ranks was kind of the only way that the Lakers could proceed forward. And someone on Twitter was like, great job deleting your JJ Redick tweet. I didn't have a tweet to delete. I said it on a podcast, and that podcast is still very much out there. I felt Dan Hurley would have been a good choice as well, for the same general reasons that I think JJ Redick kind of now has to be the choice. You can't bring it. So Cleveland is looking at James Borrego right now. That's been the latest news on the Cavs head coaching hunt. You can't do that if you're the Lakers. You can't just bring in a guy who was a head coach of a team, and it went fine, but unspectacular, and he's considered one of the better assistant coaches in the NBA. But you can't bring that guy in to coach a Lakers team that has LeBron in his age 40 season, and you're trying to convince someone either to come there or to trade to come there or to return there free agency-wise. The main reason, honestly, that I thought the Lakers had to go sort of outside the box with this hire, whether that's, again, Dan Hurley coming over from the college ranks or JJ Redick sliding over from ESPN broadcaster ranks, is that the Lakers' vibes under Darvin Ham were trash. Ham had ruined his relationship with seemingly the entire team, but most specifically, Austin Reeves and D'Angelo Russell. Austin Reeves is on a longer contract. D'Angelo Russell is not. The reason that I think that's important is that I also said on that show a couple weeks ago, and I'll reiterate it now, the only way the Lakers get D'Lo to come back was to have such a wildly different voice at the head of the snake that for D'Lo it would be like, all right, you know what? I like the players. I like the city. I hated my head coach. I hated the way I got blamed for crap all the time. Let me give this new regime a shot to sort of prove itself. Does that mean that it's definitely going to happen? No, I don't know. D'Lo gets blamed a lot. Sometimes it's the fans. Sometimes it's the coaching staff. Seemed like this year it was largely the coaching staff because he was pretty good when they sort of gave him a little bit of confidence to go be D'Lo. And that to me is good for the Lakers. I don't like it. If they lose D'Angelo Russell, what do they do there? They don't have the cap space to just like take his money and go find another $20-25 million guard to drop into the mix. Even if all they do with D'Lo is sign him and then package him in a trade, still the way they've got to move. From a schematic standpoint, I don't see how you could possibly change things all that much. LeBron James is still going to be the main guy, even if they continue to slowly whittle down what he does on a night-to-night basis. Anthony Davis is going to be the most important player on the team, even if he's not the guy who has the highest usage on the team. And then the guys around those dudes, if it's Reeves and it's D'Lo, will have fantasy value, and nobody else is really going to be all that close to it. So change coaches all you like. If that's your core, that's what you're looking at, kind of a retread year over year. If it's not Redick or if D'Lo doesn't come back or some combination of that stuff, then you've got a whole new thing to look at. Could Gabe Vincent step into enough fantasy value? I kind of doubt it. Does that mean more Rui Hachimura? Maybe. Like, what if D'Lo's not back? Is the backcourt Austin Reeves and who? Haven't a clue. It's not like you could slide guys down. Lakers were giant already. Rui was playing the 3, unless you want to say LeBron was the 3. Either way, those guys are both power forwards. You can't slide one of those dudes down to the 2. So it would kind of have to be Gabe Vincent or somebody they brought in. Would be kind of interesting if the JJ Redick news broke while we were on air here, but I don't expect this to be longer than about a 30, 35-minute podcast, so don't hold your breath. In terms of more relevant fantasy information, the Eric Pincus article, in my eyes, is one that we should actually pay attention to. Eric is very smart. He understands the salary cap extraordinarily well, and he has a pulse on what's going on in the NBA. So let's take a quick look at what's going on with that article, and we'll break down what it would mean if some of these things came to fruition. Do my best here to try to bring it to those of you that are watching live without a bunch of flashing things in the background. Guess number 1 from Eric. Paul George to the 76ers. Actually, I don't know what the copyright is on that, if I can put it on the screen. Either way, you can find it over at Bleacher Report. It's not paywalled or anything like that. You should go check it out. Paul George goes to the 76ers on a max contract, thus declining his final year in LA, which is at $49 million, to go to Philly for 4 years at about $212. It's a difference of about $9 million over the span of those seasons. He would make more in Los Angeles, but look, I mean, end of the day, what the hell's the difference between $212 and $221 million for somebody when you can just invest it in an index fund and never worry about anything ever again the rest of your life? That's it. You're good. Like a bad index fund probably makes between 5 and 10% annually. That contract alone, by the end of those 4 years, like the difference, $9 million. What's the difference over 4 years? Nothing. It's nothing. It's 42 and a half or 43 million versus 44, basically. Means nothing when you talk about the kind of interest that he can accrue on this stuff, especially if he's investing in things or property or whatever. So what does that mean if it takes place? Well, obviously, the fortunes of two teams hang in the balance. Paul George is the number 12 player in fantasy basketball this year, 22.5 points per game, 5.2 boards, 3.5 assists, 1.5 steals, half a block, 3.3 3-pointers, 47-91 splits this year. Very impressive percentages for PG. As the number 1B option on his team. That, I'm afraid, would not be the case in Philadelphia. Joel Embiid is the number 1. If he's on the floor, he's the number 1. If he's not, you might even argue that Tyrese Maxey is the number 1, but you could probably then at least argue that he and Paul George are kind of like a 2A and a 2B. Yes, Paul takes shots away from, Tobias Harris is not going to be back in Philadelphia. I think we can pretty much all agree that that's not happening. So, yeah, those go back into the main bucket. He was taking 13.5 shots per game. That's useful. But for PG, that ain't the 17 he was getting this year. So where are the other 3.5 basically shots going to come from in Philly? Probably, mostly, I would think, from Maxey. I don't think Joel Embiid is about to slow down what he's doing out there. He's an efficiency Goliath. And Maxey was very good, but he ain't Joel Embiid. So now you've got this downtick. Maxey does less. He'll get drafted probably in the top 20, and it won't get there. Paul George, he does less. I don't know that he gets drafted in the top 20 if he ends up in Philadelphia, but there's a drop-off coming there. I don't think he gets to 17 shots a game. I know the Clippers had 3 players, and I know James Harden was the third, but Harden was mostly just kicking the ball to PG and Kawhi. Harden only took 11.5 shots per game. He had 8.5 assists, but he wasn't shooting. He wasn't the guy putting the ball up towards the rim. So PG's going to a place where the pecking order, even if it's a little bit nebulous, he's farther down it. There's almost no way to argue that point. Philly has more shot takers, or not the right way to phrase it. Philly has more pronounced top shot takers than the Clippers did. So expect a downtick for PG, probably a downtick for Joel Embiid, but everybody's afraid of him from the knee stuff anyway, and a downtick from Tyrese Maxey, all of those guys. And what you'll probably see leading up to draft season with each of them is that actually kind of similar to what we saw with DeJounte Murray in Atlanta, where he went from really high when he was on the Spurs, then he got traded, then he bounced down from, a top 6-7 pick to like 35th. Then he bounced all the way back up to like 13th and then into the 20th. And this pendulum thing happened until he ended up sitting somewhere around about 20 and ended up being too early because we all ultimately talk ourselves into high profile fantasy guys. If Paul George ends up in Philadelphia, expect him to take a round value of hit or possibly more. But for one, this opens up a bunch of stuff with the Clippers. They'll end up spending their money somewhere because right now, the Clippers don't really have another guy. Harden and Kawhi, fine. You want to talk about like Norman Powell, have at it. But it's basically Harden and Kawhi if you remove Paul George. Norm took 10.1 shots per game this year. That wasn't really all that close to getting him to relevant fantasy value. And frankly, even when one of the stars was down, he still didn't quite get there. It's more for Harden. It's more for Kawhi. If Kawhi can stay upright, he's probably a top 4 fantasy play. He was number 7 this year. He likely goes up to top 5. Maybe 4 is a little bit of a stretch. Harden was number 26 this year. He'd be forced to shoot a little bit more. That probably moves him into the second round instead of the early third. I would also assume that the Clippers go out and do something. I don't think that they would just sit on whatever money gets left behind if Paul George does leave town. So expect someone else to probably slot in. But it's a glorious thing. You very rarely replace a player of Paul George's usage with a similar one. And that's what we're talking about on both sides of this. PG is going to be a bigger usage guy than anybody that Philly had. And whoever the Clippers potentially bring in would be lower than what left behind. So ultimately, it is a little bit linear here. PG goes to a new place. Basically, everybody there takes a hit of some capacity, PG and Maxey the most. And where he gets left behind, everybody sees a slight bump. Next on the Eric Pincus board is that the Orlando Magic will go and sign Klay Thompson. That's very interesting because Orlando needed floor spacing a lot. Their leading three-point shooter was Jalen Suggs, who hit 2. That's it. 3-pointers a game. I believe that was the lowest high number on any team in the NBA. Maybe the Pels. Did the Pels have anybody over? Yeah, no, CJ McCollum at 3.5 per game. I just know they weren't a team that took a ton of 3-pointers. Detroit, maybe? Simone Fontecchio, once he got there, hit 2 3-pointers a game. Cade was at 1.9. Detroit was ever so slightly lower than Orlando. But there's a reason that these teams struggle on offense, and it's because no one had any room to operate. I mean, most of their teams in the NBA, there wasn't anybody all that close to that low. There are other teams that need shooting, make no mistake, but all of those teams had somebody. Now, Lakers needed more shooting. Second half of the season, they were actually pretty good from three-point land, but like D'Lo hit 3 a game. LeBron and Reeves hit around 2 a game. They were second and third. Taurean Prince hit 1.8. So it actually does make a lot of sense that the Magic would go out and try to get a spot-up shooter. But it does beg the question of whether or not Klay Thompson has anything left in the tank. He played just under 30 minutes a game this year in a big up and down season for him, and ultimately ended with him coming off the bench and going full gunner mode, taking just under 15 shots a game and finishing at 106 on a per game, and largely healthy, in air quotes, season. We don't know that Klay Thompson is actually at full strength, but he played in 77 out of 82 regular season games. That's a pretty good number for Klay. If he ended up in Orlando, would a couple of things happen? Could the field goal percent bump back up from 43? I don't know. Truly. It doesn't look like he has the lift he once had before, but also a change of scenery might kind of wake him up a little bit. More importantly, would he get the minutes? I'm inclined to say yes. Boncaro played 35, Franz Wagner 32.5. But then no one else for Orlando got to 28. They really only had 2 legitimate full-time starters this year. Jalen Suggs was kind of the closest other guy at 27 minutes per game. Wendell Carter Jr., 25.5. And then a bunch of guys, Cole Anthony, 22 and change. Gary Harris, 24. Fultz, 21. Mo Wagner, 18. They didn't have a third guy they were really willing to give 30 minutes a game to. If Klay Thompson ends up in Orlando, I think I'd probably take a shot on him because he probably doesn't get drafted until around 100. And if his field goal percent ticks back up to, 45 instead of 43, and he can still get those 15 shots a game, which I think in a spaced out offense, Orlando gave a few shots to everybody. Again, there were like 6-7 guys that played around 17, 18, 19, 20 minutes a ball game. They would just have to kind of, addition by subtraction sort of deal with this. Don't give Gary Harris 24 minutes a game. You don't have to. Don't give Cole Anthony 22. Don't give Joe Ingles 17. Don't give Caleb Houston 14 minutes a game. Consolidate those under one player and let that guy go have 15 shots a game like he had in Golden State. There's a fear, obviously, that he doesn't get to the 15 shots because Franz Wagner only took 15.2. But again, Orlando just had nothing to work with on offense, so it was bogged down and ugly a lot. Even just the presence of someone who opens up space, even if he's not going to make the shots a lot of the time, is critical for what they're doing. What does it mean for Golden State? Honestly, not all that much because he was coming off the bench and he was kind of getting marginalized anyway. The Warriors are going to need Andrew Wiggins to do more. He'd be a guy that could see a bump if Klay Thompson does not re-sign there. I don't think that I'd expect enough out of Brandon Podziemski to take a trip down that particular path. I don't know what the deal is going to be with Chris Paul, so I don't know that I should even venture a guess at it. But Jonathan Kuminga also figures to do a little bit more with any kind of subtraction for the Warriors. More than anything, it's about shots getting put back into the pool. And that's the kind of thing that would help Wiggins and help Kuminga more than the other guys. Because for Chris Paul, he needs to be the guy making passes. Same for Draymond Green. And nothing is going to disrupt the work of Steph Curry. Third name on the board from that Bleacher Report deal is that the Magic also signed Malik Monk. I know the Kings want to get him back, but he may have earned himself more than that. And if he also goes to the Magic, along with Klay Thompson, they kind of blow each other up a little bit. In fact, Malik Monk becomes a better version of Cole Anthony. Bench gunner who can also pass. This one becomes a pretty hard one to handicap. As far as the Kings go, it helps Keon Ellis, who had slid into a pretty prominent role with both Herter and Monk out at the end of the year. But I don't know that it's enough for me to say, oh, yeah, this is a guy you have to go spend draft capital on. I'd rather get him at the very end and see what happens. That's Keon Ellis. Malik Monk in Orlando, I honestly, again, if it's both Klay and Monk, I don't know that I would go down either of those paths. If it's one or the other, I'd take a look. But they're going to have to thin out the herd in Orlando for me to feel like I actually want to do anything with these guys. Monk was a very interesting situation this year because he went through stretches where he was very good. Ultimately, he finished at 148 in 9-cat because the steals were low. Field goal percent wasn't particularly high. Didn't rebound at all. 15 points, 5 assists wasn't bad, but there just kind of wasn't enough other stuff from the 9-cat standpoint. 8-cat wouldn't have helped. It helped a little bit, but not by much. You needed to get a steal in there or get the assists up to 6 instead of 5. Something just needed to be more elite as opposed to, 3 okay things and then a bunch of stuff that was sub-average. I just wasn't going to get it done. Maybe 4 okay things. So I'm not super interested in Malik Monk going to a place that has 2-3 guys ahead of him. Other than if it happens here, it messes up other things going on. Speaking of Orlando, Eric Pincus, again, we're talking about this Bleacher Report article, also has Tobias Harris going to the Magic. And now if you got all 3 of those guys headed to Orlando, they're all just cooked. There just ain't enough shots left all of a sudden. Because right now, there are a bunch of shots for the Magic. And if they brought in one dude like Klay Thompson, great. Frankly, if they bring in any one of these 3 guys, if they get Klay or Monk or Tobias Harris, I would take a look at any one of those dudes, specifically Harris, because his game translates to fantasy better than the other 2 dudes, certainly 9-cat. But if it's all 3, then you recreate the logjam they had this year with everybody that wasn't one of the main dudes. Sure, if they sign these guys, if Tobias Harris goes to Orlando and they give him a decent chunk of money, he'd be a starter level dude. But let's say Klay does too. Can they give both of those guys 30 minutes? Maybe. Could they each get to 13, 14, 15 shots? It's asking a lot when you've got Banchero and Wagner in front of you. We're talking about the 3 and 4 options on the team. And Tobias did it as the 3rd option in Philly, so maybe. But also the 4th option there wasn't taking any shots. And the 4th option here, which would be Klay Thompson, would be expecting to get shots. So you're slicing the pie up even thinner. Your 3rd seed or whatever you want, the 3rd seat, I guess, it's more like an orchestra, that Tobias would be occupying is less valuable here because the 4th seat is so close to you. Is anybody going to go somewhere else is the question. The answer is no, not really. The next one is that Lauri Markkanen stays with the Utah Jazz as part of their official rebuild. And if that's the case, terrific. That means that they're going to finally start to build something after kind of half tanking the last couple of years. Markkanen's been great. He did miss a 1/3 of the season this year, but he was number 14 when he was upright. He's an easy mid-second rounder on a per-game basis, thanks to great percentages and threes and rebounds and scoring. And there's no reason to think of much erosion there because the other guys that Utah has are not about to go take his 16-plus shots a game away. In fact, the report we heard this morning was that Colin Sexton might end up on the trade block. Maybe he's not part of the Utah rebuild. So that's what? More for Keontae George and possibly more for the other guys that already had a bunch. So that would make him a very safe play. Isaiah Hartenstein, potentially to the Thunder, is another guess here from this Bleacher Report article. That would be fantastic. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Doesn't that team already have Chet Holmgren? Yeah, they do. And he played 29.5 minutes per ball game, which if you're just putting him at center, gives Hartenstein 18.5. And that ain't quite enough for him to do his damage. But they'll go big. I can pretty much promise you that. If they bring in Hartenstein, he would not exclusively play backup center because at some points they're going to need to knock some people around and they're going to want to keep Chet Holmgren off of those world's biggest guys. So I think you get 21 to 23 minutes out of Hartenstein if he ends up in Oklahoma City, probably not more than that. Now, Holmgren played 82 games this last year, which would make the path to additional juiciness kind of tough for Isaiah. And in 22 minutes, he sits outside the top 100. He needs to get to about 24 minutes a game to reliably be a top 100 guy. Not completely out of the question, but there would probably have to be an injury in front of him to make that come to fruition. So I like it, but it's still not a starter's job for Hartenstein. And he's a guy I think you probably don't need to draft with the Thunder. You just wait until an opportunity presents itself, and then you go do it. Guess number 7 out of 11 from the Bleacher Report piece, Caleb Martin, also to the Thunder. Don't care. I think we can jump right over that one. He didn't really have value in Miami, but for a game here and a game there, and he won't with OKC. A more interesting one, Tyus Jones joins his brother Tre Jones with the San Antonio Spurs. This would be very good for Victor Wembanyama more than anything else, to have a legitimate starting caliber point guard along with him. Tyus Jones played 29 and change minutes a game this year, averaged 12 points, 7.3 assists, 1.1 steals, 1.5 3-pointers on 49-80 splits. Can the 49% hold up? Yeah, honestly, I don't know. Spurs are weird, but passing to Wemby is pretty easy. You got a big target, the easiest target to pass to in the NBA. He would immediately slot in as the starting point guard. I don't see him losing that job. Tyus is the better of the Jones brothers. 30 minutes a game is questionable if they're trying to maintain any sort of health. But I would definitely take a shot on Tyus Jones. Obviously, you leave Tre Jones around in that instance because he almost immediately becomes the backup. Devin Vassell, does he get helped by this? Maybe call it neutral. Wemby, that's good news. Keldon Johnson, Blech, Sohan, Blech, and Tre Jones, who I kind of had to get forced into picking him up for a couple of weeks this year. He's a Blech also. Number 9, the Mavs trade Tim Hardaway Jr. to keep Derrick Jones Jr. This doesn't matter all that much, but for the games where Luka or Kyrie was hurt this past year, Tim Hardaway Jr. was the guy who stepped up to go get some buckets. I don't have any idea who that guy becomes. Is any Derrick Jones Jr.? He's a better role player around Luka and Kyrie, but there just isn't now a second scorer on the team when one of the stars is down. Tim Hardaway Jr. averaged 14.5 points a game this season, but that jumped by 4 or 5 when one of the main dudes was down. He was the guy who picked up that usage. Some would go to a PJ Washington. Some would go to like a Josh Green or a Jaden Hardy, but none of those guys sees enough of a bounce to where this year, Tim Hardaway was awful when the team was healthy. He's number 203 to finish the season. But when you had a pathway for him, and there were a couple of games in there where both Luka and Kyrie were out, then you had Hardaway taking freaking 20 shots or more. And it doesn't matter how god-awful your fantasy game is. If you're taking 20 shots a night, you're probably going to have some kind of value. But this would put him somewhere else, something to keep an eye on. Probably a role player on an okay team, but who knows? Maybe he ends up either doing a lot on a tanking team or nothing on a tanking team. Super polarizing, but someone you should probably keep an eye on, because what if he ends up in a place where he gets 15 shots? Okay. And then PJ Washington probably becomes a guy that is must draft in that scenario. And he was startable for Dallas down the stretch when he got really, really hot. That's not, again, these were not sustainable numbers. But if he's now the third option on offense, and I get it, the top two options are taking 43 freaking shots between the two of them, but some of those 12 and chains Tim Hardaway shots are going to go to a non-star player. Just a couple names left. Number 10 on their guest board, Chris Paul to the Lakers, comma, finally. This article, again, Eric Pincus's guesses on NBA free agency over at Bleacher Report, which I thought would be kind of a fun thing to go through and see what it would mean for fantasy. This would also include LeBron James re-signing with the Lakers. Chris Paul not going to get $30 million from a Golden State team that's paying $9,000 bazillion to compete on an annual basis. And Chris Paul goes to the Lakers to play with his banana boat buddy. This is a really helpful ad if it happens. Lakers need someone who can run things when LeBron is not out there and D'Lo is not having one of his big-time games. I like Austin Reeves a lot, and his passing has improved over the last couple of seasons, but it's still not elite. LeBron, far and away the best passer on the Lakers, and then there's this long gap before you get to D'Angelo Russell, and then there's kind of another little bit of a gap before you get to Austin Reeves. If you put someone in there who would be the clear second best passer on the Lakers, even if Chris Paul only plays 20, 22 minutes a game, that becomes useful. Because, I mean, more than anything, having a guy like that can get a ball to Anthony Davis in better spots. He becomes like an Austin Reeves semi-replacement in certain lineups, and it would give the team a lot of flexibility. Is he a fantasy draft piece? Absolutely not. No chance. Chris Paul revealed himself to finally officially be too old, even for the old man squad this past season, because he's just not himself anymore. And that's okay. Guys eventually get too old, usually get a little bit of warning on it. And last year was kind of a warning year on Chris Paul. He wasn't quite as good, but he was still a win. This year was the first season in a long time he's been a draft day loss, basically since Houston. 26.5 minutes a game. He was number 103 because he just doesn't shoot well anymore. I don't think he's getting more than 26.5 minutes a game almost no matter where he goes. So if this is really the fantasy profile for Chris Paul, he would not be a draftable asset, even though from a reality standpoint, I think he'd be pretty useful. And then the final tab on this article that we'll look through, this was it's listed as the many re-signings. Again, the Bleacher Report article. Sixers bring back Kelly Oubre Jr., not all that interested there, especially if they bring in Paul George. They also re-signed Kyle Lowry. Don't care. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope re-signs with the Nuggets. I mean, he'll just keep doing what he's done for like the last 4 seasons in a row, which is hang out right at the edge of the top 100. Semi-useful in Roto. I mean, kind of useful in head-to-head because he played 76 ball games. Not a terrible thing, but he's not really a needle mover. LeBron James may opt out to add a no-trade clause, but likely extends with the Lakers. DeMar DeRozan extends with the Chicago Bulls before he hits free agency, which would have to happen now basically over the next 2 weeks, by the way, because free agency for teams to re-sign their own players started today. So DeRozan, back with Chicago, he likely becomes another old man play for like the 95th year in a row. Siakam returns to Indiana. Not a fantasy game that I like in terms of how it translates to 8 and 9 cat all that much. Harden stays with the Clippers. Probably a 3rd round pick in Harden. OG Anunoby sticks with the Knicks. Hard to trust him in a non-games cap environment. But he would have a pretty good role with New York if he could stay healthy. Nick Claxton stays with Brooklyn. He had a big drop-off this year. Some of that was field goal percent. Some of that was free throw percent. I don't think I'd take Claxton earlier than about 55. but becomes a relatively safe center in that range. And the restricted free agents that Eric expects to stay put: Tyrese Maxey in Philly, Emmanuel Quickley in Toronto, Patrick Williams with Chicago, and Obi Toppin with the Blazers. And I have nothing to add on any of those guys because their fortunes are tied to other things going on their own teams. And that is your goofball list, the Bleacher Report. Where do we think they're headed list? And for us, what does it mean for fantasy? Thank you to Bleacher Report for putting out that article that we were able to spend a show on. And now you guys are ready. You guys already know my thoughts if certain players shift from where they are. If you're interested in what I think is going to happen, I do think Paul George changes teams. And I'm quite willing to be wrong. I think Klay Thompson also switches teams. I don't have a good feel on the Malik Monk thing because I don't know exactly the contractual gap there. Tobias Harris definitely switches teams. That one feels like a shoe-in. And then the other stuff, I don't really know. I mean, Hartenstein feels like he can find a pretty good role on a young team, a badly needed player. He's going to make himself a bunch of money. So, yep, probably ends up somewhere else as well. And then again, we just adjust. This is also, by the way, a really good reason to not do your boards now. Wait until after free agency. I also think that, and I know we reference a Roto mock that's happening right now. Some of the experts are putting that together. We can't really use that as gospel. As nice as it is to have as sort of like a passing reference, a lot of these guys are going to change teams, and that's going to kind of reshuffle the board a bit. Those mock results are useful more for an area where a player's going, as opposed to a set in stone, hard and fast. This is a narrow window where this guy's going to end up. And honestly, like some of these guys could jump a long way. Anywho, thank you to everybody for tuning in. Again, if you're watching this show, please take a moment to hit the thumbs up button in the corner and subscribe. If you're listening only, follow. Spotify, I believe the button says follow. Apple says subscribe. And if you have a second to do a 5-star review, Spotify, I know, forces you to listen to at least one episode before you can leave a review. I don't think Apple does. Those go a long way right now as we continue to try to rebuild what took almost a decade to build over on our old feed, but we're doing it again over here. Shout out to all the amazing members of the Old Man Squad and all the followers that we've accrued so far. Please help us find some more as we weave our way through the NBA offseason. Tomorrow, we're going to get into NBA draft stuff, which is kind of fun. Talking to Kyle Irving, not Kyrie Irving, Kyle Irving, who covers the NBA and the NBA draft for Sporting News, also plays some fantasy basketball, so he'll help us kind of translate some of that. Talking to Noah Rubin on Thursday, who we had on the show a couple weeks ago. He's big into fantasy, so that's someone that's also been watching the draft and prospects very closely. Hopefully next week before the draft, we can talk to my good friend David Williams. He was the one that turned us on to Mark Williams in the NBA before he got drafted. And then I think that leaves us one, maybe two extra shows where we could try to wedge in some draft content. And if we can't, it'll come down to, again, kind of guest schedules and things like that. If we can't wedge in some draft content there, we've still got the Old Man Squad, ADP versus reality, all that stuff that we can kind of work our way through. I'm Dan Besbris. Thanks again, everybody. Back with you tomorrow, probably a little bit earlier in the day, but I don't know. It's the off season. So, and the words of the immortal Eric Cartman, whatever. It's my hot body. I do what I want.